Good morning, everybody. It is time to go ahead and get started. It's just a little bit past, so I'm going to talk extra fast just to kind of catch up because we have quite a bit to get through. This morning we're going to be discussing Jerusalem. We've been kind of going in through countries and looking at those individually. Obviously today with a city like Jerusalem, we're going to be just in that city. That being said, I think this might be the longest class that we have all quarter, and so we'll have quite a bit to discuss. Next week we have Rome, so Rome also has a lot obviously to discuss, so we'll spend quite a bit on that one. And then the week after we will finish out with Asia Minor, and that's the 7 churches of Asia, that whole scene. It's all about Bible geography, the events that happen, kind of the behind-the-scenes aspect of it, putting ourselves in that. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Obviously, if you have thoughts or comments, feel free to bring them up. As you probably have noticed by this point in the quarter, I'm not super good at lecture. I like to kind of have discussions. So please bring up comments, thoughts, anything you want to talk about. That's what we're going to do today. I did not see who has the first prayer, so whoever has it. Jeff? Joe does. Joe, we'll ask Joe to lead us in a word of prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day, this first day of the week, for this opportunity that we have this morning. Pray that you'll find this service pleasing to you through the prayers and the songs that we sing, for this lesson that Brady's about to bring to us and the sermon that follows. We ask that you'll watch over and protect each of us. Thankful for the fellowship of this church. Guide, guard, and direct us throughout this life. Forgive us for our daily sins. Things we ask in Christ's holy name.
Amen. Thank you. Obviously, when you talk about a city like Jerusalem, it's got a lot of history to it. It's arguably the, quote, holiest city on the planet, so there's quite a bit to go through. We're not going to have any time to go through all of it. Obviously, there's so much that we could talk about. We're also not going to be discussing current events. I know that there's a lot happened in that part of the world this last week. We're not going to be discussing any of that. We're trying to keep it apolitical, just keep everything kind of centered around the Bible. Jerusalem is, however, called the city of peace. Is there any peace about it? No. Obviously, there's wars all the time. And that's not probably, and maybe I'm literally violating the rule I just talked about. I don't think that's going away anytime soon. I think it's always going to be kind of a violent, kind of contested place. And nothing's changed. Obviously, it's always been that way. It's been that way since the very beginning. When was the first mention of Jerusalem in Scripture? And does anybody know? Of course Curtis knows. Go ahead. Okay, I thought you were going to say the second one, and you're right, that is the first one. The first one goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 14, Melchizedek, king of Salem. That's the very first mention of it. That's an interesting thing because we talked about earlier the whole city-state idea. That's when Salem was obviously a city-state. You have the Sodom and Gomorrah city-states lining up against the other kings, and so you've got that whole battle. That's where Lot is taken. Melchizedek makes this amazing appearance, and then he virtually disappears throughout history. He does make reappearances in Psalms. Obviously, Hebrews talks about him quite a bit, but that is the very first mention of him as being the very first mention of Jerusalem. What is the second mention of Jerusalem? Lays dormant for a while. John, go ahead. If it's the 7th, it's fine. It's okay. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if it's Jebus or Jebus or something like that. I mean, Okay, so that's the last one. You're definitely getting in trouble for bringing that one up. But yes, you're right. The middle one in between that, and like you said, there's lots of them you can talk about, but we don't oftentimes think about it in terms of the Jebusites. But you're exactly right. When you talk about Jerusalem, the original name for it was the city of Jebus, and that one you do mention in Joshua chapter 10, verse 1. What's happening in Joshua chapter 10? We just got done with Joshua, I think it was last quarter, maybe the quarter before. What was happening in Joshua 10 and 11? Notice how I put that he heard ... There's everything open to interpretation. What's happening in that time? Right. Joshua was supposed to kill all the inhabitants. That's kind of his decree for all of Israel. He just gets done. Obviously, he destroys Jericho. I think in Joshua chapter 6, Joshua chapter 7. He destroys Ai. That requires 2 kind of attacks on that one. Joshua chapter 10, verse 1, it says, when Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, heard that he had attacked Ai, that he had captured Jericho. You also have the story of the Gibeonites that's thrown in there as well. When Adoni-Zedek hears about how Israel's doing, he then decides that he's going to make an alliance. This is where you have the southern kingdoms that start to rise up against Israel. So you have kind of this interesting section where whenever Joshua goes into Israel, he takes Jericho, he takes Ai, he takes Gibeon. Jerusalem is literally right there next to that. But instead of fighting them, he kind of goes to Jerusalem and then goes down a little bit. So it's an interesting kind of runaround. And that's what we'll notice a lot when we look at Jerusalem. There's a lot of people dancing around it, obviously for geographical reasons. And then the last one, as John mentioned, at least the last major one that we're going to discuss, is here in 2 Samuel chapter 5. Look at this chapter. 2 Samuel chapter 5, starting in verse 1. This is well into David's reign. If you are reading in 2 Samuel, probably the first 4 chapters, it's just victory after victory after victory, a lot of those types of things happening. 2 Samuel chapter 5, starting in verse 1, says, Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in. The Lord said to you, You will shepherd my people over Israel, or shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel. In other words, Saul may have been the actual king, you were the de facto king. So all the elders, verse 3, of Israel came to the king at Hebron. King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron. They anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. That's laying the groundwork for what he's going to talk about. Verse 6, Now the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. That's where you see the similarity. Jerusalem was the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, and they said to David, You shall not come in here, but the blind and lame will turn you away, thinking David cannot enter here. Nevertheless, David captured the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. David said on that city, Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him reach the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul, through the water tunnel. Therefore they say, The blind or the lame shall not come into the house. David lived in the stronghold, called it the city of David. David built all around from the Millo and inward. David became greater and greater, for the Lord God of hosts was with him. How does this whole scene of the capture of Jerusalem take place? Now, this is a city that largely eluded Israel, but what happens there in verses 6 through 10? David doesn't just take it like he does every other one. That'd be too easy of a story. David goes up to Jerusalem. What is Jerusalem's stance towards him? Yeah, you're not coming in, which is probably said to every conqueror that's tried to take him over. So it's not an uncommon welcome. It's a horrible welcome. Obviously, I thought we were friends. What do they tell him specifically there? Right, the lame and the blind will turn you away. I looked at this quite a bit over the last few weeks, because when you look at what he says here in this passage, reach the lame and the blind, you would think to yourself, well, obviously Jerusalem has such an amazing defense system that even the lame and blind can turn you away. That's the common interpretation. I think there's a little bit more to that, because when you look specifically at what he says in verse 8, he says the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. There's the saying there. But then he also mentions that the lame and the blind who are hated by David's soul. Does David hate lame and blind people? This is the issue I had with it.
Well, he took care of Saul's main relatives.
Well, yeah, Mephibosheth. I thought you were talking about how he butchered 7 of Saul's relatives in 2 Samuel. You're right. He did take care of Mephibosheth. And that's an argument for why this isn't exactly the original interpretation, that he just hates these people and he just wants to destroy all of them. Curtis?
It seems to be that the lame and the blind are not allowed to go to the temple. I don't know if there's a correlation.
Well, the temple wasn't here at this point. So that's true too, but the Jebusites weren't exactly a part of Israel proper. And so I can kind of see what you're getting there. You have in the old law embedded the idea that these people can't have any association with it. So that might be part of it. Levi?
I don't know if it's meaning anything, but the way it's bracketed in the New King James indicates that the lame and the blind are just another way that it's a way that he's describing the Jebusites as a people.
Yeah, it could be. I actually hadn't thought about that. That maybe they're just lame and blind in comparison.
I mean literally. I mean like that.
Yeah.
He sees them as outcasts from society.
That's probably true too, and that goes into what I want to talk about with this here just a second. I think when you look at the issues between the Jebusites and Israel, I do think there's quite a bit of tension there. John?
I really look at it as it's a taunt towards David and his army. And so David says, okay, you say the lame and the blind are going to keep me out, I'll show you.
Yeah.
Take your taunt and put it on me.
So in other words, there's no lame and blind. I'm just using that as a taunt. And that may be part of it too. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going for. It's an intimidation factor,
Right.
you know, and it may work against the other countries, but it's not going to work against
Yeah, I mean, and that's the interesting part of this, is David has a pretty good track record by 2 Samuel 5 of pretty much annihilating everybody. So the idea that the Jebusites think that they can stand up to David is comical to me. Maybe they are trying to intimidate him, which is obviously a last-ditch measure. This all kind of fades into, and we don't really have time to go too much into this, but I do want to point out 1 Chronicles chapter 11. If you take the time to go over there, there's a similar passage here in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, the exact same story. And that's where these people come out to David and say, the lame and the blind are going to take you over. And then David responds by saying, whoever can be the first one to break into the city of Jerusalem, you can be my commander. Of course, the first person who broke through, who also became his commander, was who? Joab, exactly. And so the thought is, at least predominantly there, is that what he's talking about is he puts the lame and the blind in the front because these are the cursed of God. Anybody that touches them, according to ancient superstitions, will then become cursed themselves. So it's kind of an intimidation factor in a sense, but it's also the fear from the people. We don't want to also be a part of that. Joab has very little regard to superstition, very little regard for any kind of theology in general. That's just his track record. Obviously, he's the first one in, destroys everything, and he becomes the commander. You're not allowed to. We're going to keep going.
No, just that, why wouldn't the Jebusites feel that way? They've been there for how many hundreds of years at this point? After Israel had already come over and conquered the land, and this is one of those places where they just never did.
Did you look at these notes beforehand? Because I do want to talk about that. I just don't want to talk about you. So I'm pushing back on your pushback. Because I think you bring up an excellent point in regards to the city of Jerusalem as a whole, and that's what I want to talk about here in just a second. But you're right. I mean, why would they allow David to come in when obviously there's been some coexisting there to begin with? I think that's a totally valid point. Yeah, Sandra?
Verse 63, Joshua 15 says, now as for the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah could not drive them out. So the Jebusites lived with the sons of Judah at Jerusalem unto this day.
They did coexist, and Joshua 10 verse 63 is a companion parallel passage. It's not the same thing, but it is talking about the same thing as Judges chapter 1, and that's why I think it's important to bring this up. Judges chapter 1 verse 21, it says they did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. And so there's a little bit of a difference in those two verses, Judges 1, Judges 10, or Joshua 10. They talk about would not, could not, did not. Whatever the reason for it is, they didn't drive them out. And I think that's what Nathan's point is. That's obviously what Sandra's point is as well. When you look back at 2 Samuel chapter 5, there's another little mention here, and I think it's worth pointing out. In verse 9, it talks about the Millo. What is the Millo? And I may be pronouncing that one wrong. Millo. What is the Millo? Does that ring a bell with anybody? Citadel is probably a pretty good word for it. A better description probably for it would be just this kind of city of earthen works. It's this defense system on one side of the city that had been torn down. It's basically a big pile of rubble, big pile of dirt. It's extremely tall. Its primary purpose is for defense. David used it for the defense of Jerusalem during his time period. It's torn down by the time that Solomon takes king, and the reason that this is noteworthy is because Solomon goes through great expense to rebuild the Millo, and the chief over the forced labor is none other than Jeroboam, who would later rebel against Solomon because of these extravagant works. And so I think when you look at these little nuggets here in 2 Samuel, you notice how all these kind of pieces fit together. Millo serves a great purpose in David's time, does not really serve that great of a purpose in Solomon's time. It comes at great expense to the kingdom. Somebody have any thoughts or comments on any of that? As was mentioned, when you look at the taking of Jerusalem versus when the people should have taken it over, you have this long 400-year gap. The sons of Benjamin, Judges chapter 1, verse 21, did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Why did they not take Jerusalem? You can't answer my question with a question. I'm the one asking questions here. But you are right. I think you can ask that basically about anything. Why did they not take out Jerusalem? Why did they not take out all these other places? Jerusalem is intense. I mean, it makes sense why you physically can't take it over. That being said, they've been able to take over everything else. So God with them, they should be able to take over this as well. Take the darkest of stabs in the dark. Go for it.
Because they needed someplace to live. After they took them over, they were destroying
That could be it, although there's a habit of defeating them, displacing them, and obviously they slaughter most of them. So you'd think the same pattern would happen here, especially in literally the heart of Canaan. But yeah, maybe they need some other place to live, so we're not gonna slaughter all of them. John?
Well, after Joshua, after he conquered most of Canaan, he divided it up into the inheritance for the tribes.
Right.
And so, to me, these tribes are trying to do it alone, and they're not united. If they were united, they probably could have done it.
I think that's a fair statement, and I don't disagree with that. The interesting thing about where Jerusalem lays in terms of the boundary divisions is I think it technically lays at the beginning inside of Benjamin. Problem with Benjamin over time is Benjamin gets absorbed by Judah. That Benjamin is the smaller of the tribes, obviously. So who's really in charge of it? Well, the Benjamites are, which is Saul's territory. Saul should have been the king, should have been the person to take it over of anybody, but it never really gets assimilated. And I think there's lots of things we can probably hypothesize about this. Why did they not take it over? Is it too strong? Are they too lazy? There's lots of reasons. I think it really comes down to what's in the verse. What does it says that they did there? Instead of taking it over, what did they do? What's that? They just lived with them. So by failing to take it over, they essentially assimilated the Jebusites inside the city, which is going to come back to bite them because what happens at the end of Judges? Remember this massive civil war that takes place? Where does that start at? It starts near the tribe. At this point, it would have been in the tribe of Benjamin, but it starts in the city of Jebus because there's a horrific crime, which we won't have time to go into right now, horrific crime that takes place in the city of Jebus. Nobody really does anything about it. Then they take it into a national scale, and everybody comes against the Benjamites, and that's where you have this massive civil war. It all starts in the city of Jebus, which is, when you read that sin, that thing that takes place in Judges 19:20, it's like you're reading the story of Sodom and Gomorrah all over again. It's just a horrific thing. So the fact that they lived alongside them, I think, is foolish, but it also shows that they just didn't really care to take it, which is the pattern you see elsewhere. Somebody else have any thoughts or comments? Okay, when you look at a relief map of Jerusalem, it makes sense why there's not a lot of competition to go take it. When you look at this relief map, you've got mountain, you've got ravine. It's a very elevated part. We're not going to beat this one to death because we've talked about quite a bit inside of Judah and Israel so far. There's just a mountainous terrain. Jerusalem sits up on the heights of it. There's lots of ancient literature that talks about how you can see mountains, but you don't really see Jerusalem until you kind of crest that mountain next to it. And this is how it would look, especially during the time period of David. When you look David pre, this is the city that you're looking at. Very compartmentalized city. What's up there at the north of that, though? If anybody can read that. Can anybody? Yeah, okay. What's up at the top of that? Maybe nobody can read that, sorry. I'm like 8 feet from it, so I don't know.
Mount Moriah.
Mount Moriah. What's the story behind Mount Moriah? That is quite significant. Exactly. It's where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. Obviously, that stops and that doesn't take place. It's also the place when you look at 2 Samuel chapter 22, David takes the census, which he's not allowed to. In order to make up for that sin of taking the census, what does he have to do? Does anybody remember? He had choices of 3 different punishments, and he ultimately throws himself into the mercies of God. And you're right about that. In order to quell all of it, though, he has to do something. John? He had to build an altar. Where did he have to build an altar? I know. We're really getting deep in the weeds, but this is Jerusalem. I mean, this is where we're at.
He went to, they told him, I forget where,
Mm-hmm.
the man's name, but he had to go there and buy the threshing floor and get by the oxen and the cart.
Right.
So he was, David said, I'm not going to take anything for free from you, I'm going to pay for it.
Right.
But I don't remember the name of it.
Well, you've got about 89% of that story, so I'd say that's pretty good. When you look at that story in 2 Samuel 22, he has to go buy the materials, he has to go buy the threshing floor. The threshing floor is of Araunah the Jebusite. Jebusite is an original inhabitant of Jerusalem. So when David goes and buys it, that's when Araunah says, "You're my king. I'm not going to sell it to you. I'm going to give it to you." David responds with, "Well, I'm not going to sacrifice anything to the Lord, that which costs me nothing," which is a fantastic verse that talks about the nature of sacrifice. That's on Mount Moriah. And so obviously that's going to be a very important place, because eventually when Solomon builds the temple, he builds a temple on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, on the Mount Moriah, where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. And so you can kind of see how the city of Jerusalem extends northward to kind of encompass that. This is what is in modern day called the Old City. The Old City is an incredibly packed and cramped area of Jerusalem. Most of modern Jerusalem has developed to the west, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we talk about this. But Jerusalem remains this kind of just really compressed. The population density is higher than almost just anywhere else in the world. But it kind of extends northward. And so that's where the temple begins, or temple area is at. That's that gigantic square in the middle of it. But there's two other areas outside of Jerusalem that are also worth mentioning. The first one is this Valley of Kidron. Does anybody know anything about the Valley of Kidron? That's on the bottom. Sorry, it's flipped up there. Go ahead.
That's where they dump their trash and burn it.
That is where they dump their trash. Look at 2 Kings chapter 23. They basically do what every modern city does, which is they just take their trash outside the city, burn it, put it in a landfill, whatever they need to. They're not big into recycling, which I think is an issue. 2 Kings chapter 23, starting in verse 1. This is the Kidron Valley. And the Kidron Valley is pretty popular. You'll see this mentioned elsewhere in Scripture. I think it has about 50 or 60 mentions. 2 Kings chapter 23, starting in verse 1. It says, "The king sent, they gathered to him all the elders of Judah and of Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of the Lord, all the men of Judah, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, the priests and the prophets, all the people, both small and great. And he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which was found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord to walk after the Lord, to keep his commandments, his testimonies, his statutes with all his heart, with all his soul, to carry out the words of this covenant that were written in this book. And all the people entered the covenant." You have a spiritual renewal under Josiah the king. "The king commanded Hilkiah the high priest and the priests of the second order and the doorkeepers to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels that were made for Baal, for Asherah, for all the host of the heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron and carried their ashes to Bethel. He did away with the idolatrous priest whom the kings of Judah had appointed to burn incense in the high place in the city of Judah and the surrounding areas of Jerusalem. Also those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun, the moon, and to the constellations, to all the host of heaven. He brought out the Asher from the house of the Lord outside Jerusalem to the brook Kidron, burned it at the brook Kidron, ground it to dust, and threw its dust on the graves of the common people." Kidron Valley is an area known for being a trash heap, but what is it also known for? And this is arguably more important. What's that? It was outside the city. I think that's on the western side of Jerusalem. So it's not directly south where the Kidron Valley is. But you're right. I mean, when you look at anything outside the city, there's kind of this natural border outside the city, inside the city, that kind of thing.
Is this the area that is referenced possibly by Jesus when he's teaching, I don't remember if it's within a parable or not, but he teaches to the common man in language that they can understand. It seems like this is the area that is referenced to give some symbolescence to the idea of eternal flame in hell, because there's a constant fire burning here to burn their trash before. But am I on the right track here, or am I totally off base?
This is not this area, but that other square is. And so I want to talk about that here in just a second. But the reason I said that is because the two are very much linked. I don't think there is that quite a delineation between the two, except in terms of just physical location, because the way that they're talked about is very similar. But to your question, the specific area is the Valley of Hinnom, which is where Jesus would talk about right after that. I saw another hand over.
Gehenna pretty much refers to it, but you're saying that it's the other square, right?
Yeah, it's the other square. Yeah, it's the one on the left. That's the Hinnom Valley, and that's directly southwest. It's farther away from the city of Jerusalem than where the Kidron Valley is, and that may be the only difference between the two. But the Kidron Valley, as it's mentioned here in verses 1 through 3, I mean, you have all these great reforms. Verses 4 through 6, what did they do in the Kidron Valley? It's not just a place where they burned the trash, but it's where they did what? Burn the idols, exactly. If you're going to get rid of these idols, you take it to the Kidron Valley, which is just south of it, burn it all, do away with it. When you look at the Kidron Valley today, though, for a trash heap, it doesn't look that half bad. I mean, it's really kind of a nice vacation spot if you're into that kind of thing. But right below it, you also have this mention of 2 Kings chapter 2 of it being a dividing point. And this is another area, this is, when we talk about boundary lines, like we talked about at the beginning with where culture begins and ends, geography plays a huge part in that. And so the Kidron Valley is kind of seen as the southern border of Jerusalem. If you're going to leave it, you can go up to the edge of the brook of Kidron. You go past that, you're kind of outside of where Jerusalem is. This is where Solomon is talking to one of the enemies of David, saying, don't leave Jerusalem. The brook of the Kidron is there. The Valley of Hinnom, which is what is also talked about, is also a very nice vacation spot. It is also talked about in very similar terms to what you would talk about with the Valley of the Kidron. Look in 2 Kings chapter 23, starting in verse 7, so one verse after we stopped. It says, he also broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes, which were on the house of the Lord, where the women were weaving hangings for the Asherah. Then he brought all the priests from the cities of Judah. He defiled the places where the priests had burned incense. From Geba to Beersheba, he broke down the high places of the gates, which were at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the governor of the city, which were on one's left at the city gate. Nevertheless, the priests of the high places did not go up to the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, but they ate unleavened bread among their brothers. He also defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no man may make his son or daughter pass through the fire for Molech. He did away with the horses which the kings of Judah had given to the sun at the entrance to the house of the Lord, by the chamber of Nathan-Melech, the official, which was in the precinct, and he burned the chariots of the sun with fire. There's a big difference between what's in the valley of Kidron and in the valley of Hinnom. What's the difference between those? Child sacrifices is the big issue. So when you're talking about the difference between these two locations, did they destroy idols there? Yes. But in the Valley of Hinnom, what specifically was taking place, as Nathan mentioned? They were engaging in cultic prostitution. They were engaging in child sacrifices. And so in my opinion, that's part of why it has a graver reputation in the Valley of Kidron, is because these types of things were actually happening there. When you look at Jeremiah chapter 7, flip over there if you would. You see kind of more of this illusion. Jeremiah chapter 7. Jeremiah chapter 7. Starting in verse 31. Jeremiah chapter 7, starting verse 31. He says, they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command. And this is probably the most shocking part of these prophecies. It did not even come into my mind. I'm not saying that, he's certainly not saying that God hadn't thought about it. He's just saying this is beyond comprehension, in other words. Verse 32, therefore, behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, will no longer be called Topheth, or the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of the slaughter. For they will bury in Topheth, because there is no other place. The dead bodies of this people will be food for the birds of the sky, for the beasts of the earth, and no one will frighten them away. Then I will make to cease from the cities of Jerusalem, from the streets of Jerusalem, the voice of joy, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, for the land will become a ruin. In other words, this area of Hinnom used to be a place that celebrated idolatry. It used to be a place where this was engaged in openly. What is God going to do with it? He's going to make it a wasteland. He's going to change the reputation of it from being something like this to what else? The Valley of the Slaughter. This is the place where you go to die. And so if you're looking at what Jesus talks about with the Gehenna, the place where the worm dieth not, the fire is not quenched, this is the most vivid description of it, not only because of its physical issues, but also primarily because of its spiritual issues. And I think that's part of why it's isolated. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Yes.
In Revelation, he talks about the battle of Armageddon.
Right.
And also, when Joshua was king, he went out to meet Pharaoh Necho, and he was defeated. And I can't remember where. Was it Armageddon?
So-
Where is Armageddon?
So Armageddon is a purely New Testament type of idea in Revelation specifically. What you're talking about with the kings, I think you're thinking of Josiah instead of Joshua. Josiah, that's what I heard, but I could be wrong. I'm not firing on all cylinders today, so yeah. But Josiah goes out to meet Pharaoh Necho at the Valley of Megiddo, and that's a different area than what the Valley of Hinnom is. That's farther outside of Jerusalem, primarily because Josiah shouldn't have ever even been there. That's a battle between Babylon and Assyria that Josiah inserts himself into when he should never have been there to begin with. He dies, but that's all in that valley. And that is where there's a lot of battles of those kinds of things.
Armageddon, I think it's a flat plain. It's like ideal for battle to take place.
Right.
That's where they go to execute that war.
Yeah, it's a very open, like you mentioned, it's a very open area, which makes sense because when Josiah dies, and I feel like I'm misremembering this, I think he dies in a chariot, which ain't going to happen in this area. It's going to happen in something like the Valley of Megiddo. So that's a completely different place, but I see where you're at. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Yeah, Kim?
Secular history tells us that their belief was that they sacrificed their firstborn to Molech to begin to find that it would ensure prosperity.
I actually didn't know that, but it's hard to fathom how killing somebody ensures prosperity. But I get where you're coming from with that's the paganistic and that's just what they do. Yeah. I don't know. I don't want to, certainly not going to talk about it on Father's Day, but the idea of child sacrifice, I mean, I can't think of any more reprehensible sin, and I think that God frames it the exact same way in the Old Testament. There's literally nothing they did worse than offering their sons to Molech. And that's where I'm going to stop it, so I don't want to go any further than that. Anybody have any thoughts or comments that doesn't make me want to cry? All right outside the Valley of Hinnom, the Brook of Kidron, you have all these things that are flanking on the south portion of it, the southwest portion. On the east side of it, you have the Mount of Olives. What's the significance of the Mount of Olives?
Where Jesus went to pray, where he was taken.
It is roughly where Jesus went to pray. That's actually the Garden of Gethsemane, which is a portion of the Mount of Olives. But you're right, it's in that same general area. Curtis?
That was his escape.
Yeah, it's his escape. So if you look at specifically the Mount of Olives in the New Testament, it appears, I think, 3 or 4 different times in the story of Jesus, and they all have to do with periods of reflection. When Jesus goes off by himself, when he's observing the city of Jerusalem, when he's talking to his disciples, it all kind of seems as if he's just kind of contemplating the city of Jerusalem. And I don't want to get too emotional in on this, but when you think about his monologue in Matthew 23, woe to you, woe to you, and then he ends it by saying, how often I wanted to gather you under my wing as a hen gathers her chicks. There's a love that Jesus has for the city of Jerusalem. Mount of Olives seems to be the place where he goes to contemplate his relationship as God with his people. And that's probably a conversation for another time, but it really does, because when you look at it, you can see literally everything. I mean, you can see the entire city. The old city would not nearly has been as deep as what you're looking at there. But it's also kind of this boundary marker. You see David passing through it a couple of times. You see Jesus obviously sitting there. At the bottom of the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane. And this obviously is a huge tourist section. People go to this all the time. I'm sure it looked exactly like this when Jesus was there. But this is where his betrayal comes into play. It's not far from where Jesus meets with the people. Jesus would meet with his apostles in an upper room inside of Jerusalem. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and that's where his prayer and that's where his betrayal takes place. Then he's carted right back inside of that. Look at Zechariah chapter 14.
Brady, what direction is this from Jerusalem?
I think it's directly due east. And I say that, and I might be 100% wrong. Somebody with Google can correct me. I just said that a couple minutes ago? All right, well, I'm not backing down. It's due east. Zechariah chapter 14. Yeah, that's where I want us to go right now. Zechariah chapter 14, starting in verse 1. Zechariah chapter 14, starting in verse 1. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil will be taken from you, will be divided among you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, half of the city exiled. But the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go forth and fight against the nations as when he fights on a day of battle. In that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half the mountain will move towards the north and the other half towards the south. Verse 5. You will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azal. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. What is happening here in Zechariah 14? Please don't be alarmed if you don't know. I don't really know. Nobody really knows. But what do you think is happening here in Zechariah 14? There's a battle. That's exactly right. Zechariah has very apocalyptic imagery in it. Very similar to Revelation in that way. What's that? God's going to win, as he wins every battle, for sure. But what's happening here in Zechariah 14? There's going to be a division. Areas divided. All the nations are going to be gathered. That's another apocalyptic type of image. You see that in Revelation. What event is this talking about, do you think? I think Zechariah is around, I'm going to get this wrong. I think it's around 400 BC. So it's after the Second Temple or during the time of the Second Temple being built. So it's a post-exilic. That's the common thought, is that the mention that he's talked about here is it talking about the destruction of Jerusalem by AD 70, especially when you consider, when you look at verse 5, you also see it, I think in verse, maybe that's anywhere else. Maybe it is just in verse 5, where he talks about people fleeing from the mountains, going away from the area. We talk about people standing on the Mount of Olives and looking at both sides of it and dividing it. There's a scene of destruction. There's also a scene of just complete abomination, complete desolation. Picture yourself as a Jew, though, in 400, 500 BC, whenever this was written, and you're reading this. What are you thinking that he's talking about? Now the idea is that it's AD 70 among Christians. Jews have a different interpretation. If you're a Jew who's gone through conquest after conquest, Jerusalem's been captured several times over, how are you reading this section? As a deliverer, exactly. That the Messiah is going to come, he's going to stand on the Mount of Olives, he's going to look at Jerusalem, he's going to gather all the nations against it, and he's going to do battle against Jerusalem to free it from its captors, and that the city of Jerusalem, the nation of Israel, will once again be free. And that is in large part why when you look to the side of the Mount of Olives, you have almost 100,000 graves that are here, primarily from all Jewish people, who are normally would be stationed somewhere else. You have family graves and things like that. These are people who a long time ago decided within the last 400 years, these are people who decided they wanted to be buried on this spot so that when the Messiah came to liberate Jerusalem and free Israel and make it a place that they could come and have this 1,000-year reign or whatever it may be, they wanted to be there when it happened. And so I think when you look at the Mount of Olives, it's kind of a tale of two stories. You have this beautiful grove where you have a lot of biblical references and a lot of history, and then you have arguably one of the most enormous graveyards in the Middle East that's crammed right there next to Jerusalem. So it paints kind of a nice contrast between the two. Anybody else have any thoughts? Yeah.
Where in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives. And then add that to the scripture that says that he heard his footsteps.
Well, the footstool idea is just power. He's just reigning over it. So if you're thinking about this from an apocalyptic sense, he's going to take over Jerusalem and then everything will kind of be dominated because all the nations are gathered to do battle against Jerusalem. It's kind of him gathering it in. And that's part of a larger conversation about how Jews would view all nations but not allow the Gentiles to be a part of the kingdom of God. That's an interesting kind of dichotomy that they have, and that's all baked into this. But you're right. I mean, the footstool is power, but this is about battle. It's about taking it over. Yeah, Gary?
Listening to these things and studying these things really helps us understand how deeply it was ingrained into the Jews and why even the apostles would struggle with saying, what do you mean you're not going to conquer? In fact, the temple's going to be
Yeah.
knocked down again.
Yeah. It's almost like arguing with the premillennialists today to say that Jesus is not going to come back and establish that. What do you mean? That's what the whole thing is about. That's really not what the whole thing's about, but it's the same type of mentality, and you're right. This is so ingrained in these people, and they've been looking forward to it. To say it's not happening is a huge, huge shock to their system, for sure. When you fly into the temple, obviously around the time of Jesus, you have just an enormous structure. And I think what gets lost sometimes when we look at, this is Herod's temple around the time of Jesus, and you can see just the size and the scope of what Jesus would be dealing with here. And this is all to scale. None of this is fabricated. This is exactly the size and everything that would have looked. You go through the court of the Gentiles, you go into the court of the priests, you go into the temple itself. When you look at just how big this temple is, What gets lost sometimes is that this temple, as Jesus would have seen it in his day, it's only really existing for around 100 years. Because after the destruction of the temple in AD 586, it stands dormant for a long period of time. And then you have the remnant that comes back, Ezra and Nehemiah that come back, they build it. And they're building a carbon copy of what they thought the temple would be. But it's not anything quite like it was in the time of Solomon, obviously. That temple, the second temple that was built under Zerubbabel, that stands for 400 years. Herod, in part of his massive building projects, decides this doesn't really look that good. So he tears down the second temple brick by brick, builds it, and expands the courtyard elsewhere, because on the outside of those perimeter of the temple, you can do what? As any good politician would want to do. What can you do when people come in to worship? You can sell things, and you can tax people, and you can do all those other types of things. And so I think what gets lost sometimes is just how short a time period Herod's temple is actually on this earth. There's a mention elsewhere when Jesus is talking, I think in John chapter 6, when he says, tear down this temple and I will build it in 3 days. The Jews respond with, it took 46 years to build it to the point it is now, and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days. They were building it and were continuing to add to it well up until the time when Nero destroyed it, or when Titus destroyed it in AD 70. So that kind of shows just how grand and ambitious Herod's own issues was. By the way, this is the Holy of Holies. There's nothing there. Where is the Ark of the Covenant? Don't you dare. Don't you dare. Where is the Ark of the Covenant? What?
I said they don't really know.
They don't really. Nathan, where is it? It's in a crate at the Smithsonian. We all know this. Yes. Most likely destroyed during the invasion of Babylon. And that's part of the frustrating part of this, is that the area with the Temple Mount, you can't excavate it because it's dominated by 3 world religions, and so you can't really get underneath it. Is it under there? Probably not. But there is a tunnel network that exists underneath where the Temple Mount is, probably carted out at some point. But that's why when you go into the Holy of Holies during the time of Jesus, nothing there except a big rock. And that obviously is going to cause quite a bit of problems for those people who are not in the know. This is Herod's temple at scale. When you fast forward through the New Testament, you can see a couple of events that took place there. There's no knowledge specifically where Peter did his great sermon in Acts chapter 2. Probably there on the southern end of it. That makes the most sense. The Golden Gate, which is also called the Beautiful Gate, you can see it in their top right section. That's probably where Peter would go back in Acts chapter 3. People beg alms. You have another sermon by Peter, takes place at the Beautiful Gate. At the end of Acts chapter 2, whenever all of this sermon is concluded, the people respond. It says that at that point, there were added about 3,000 souls. Here's a quick question for you. How do you baptize 3,000 people in one day? Curtis knows.
Have lots of pools around the area. That was designed really for the Jewish observation.
You have pools around the area known as mikvahs, which are located immediately around the Jerusalem temple, the Herod's temple, that as you're going into the temple, religious Jews would obviously bathe and purify themselves before they go into the temple to worship. And there are anywhere between 20 or 30 of these stationed around Jerusalem, depending on how far you scale that out. There's also very elaborate ones that are right next to certain gates inside Jerusalem. But essentially what it is, it's a big purifying bath. That doesn't look very clean right now, I know. But it's a very big purifying bath. You go in, you cleanse yourself, and go out. There have been a lot of Calvinists that would argue that when Jesus talks about baptism, this is an Old Testament thing that just kind of carried over. It's really not, because you see people baptizing in lots of different things, not just mikvahs. But that's how you baptize 3,000 people in one day. You zoom out a little further, you see some various places. Solomon's porch is not where he kept his rocking chair, in case you were wondering. Solomon's porch is called that because it faces the same wall of Solomon's temple. And so Herod, wanting to honor Solomon, renamed it Solomon's porch. Obviously hiked the taxes there as well. Acts chapter 3 and verse 11 is the most prominent mention. Jesus walks through it in John chapter 10 and verse 23. The interior of the city, which we will not go into in too much detail, we'll go through this relatively quick, is obviously where Jesus walks to Golgotha. And that road for observant Catholics, people that are, I don't know really how to describe them, but very unique Catholics, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, they'll make a pilgrimage at least sometime in their life to go walk what's called the Via Dolorosa, which is the Way of Grief. And there are 15 stops total from the time of Jesus' arrest to the Mount of Golgotha, with various scenes along the way where he stopped, where he talked to somebody. One of them apparently is this, and this is apparently a rock where Jesus fell and put his hand against the brick. I don't know how they located that. But as is wont to do with a lot of these pilgrimages site, you can buy any sorts of souvenirs right alongside that. I'm sure the two had no coordination whatsoever. But this is a place where Jesus allegedly put his hand on the wall. People pray and they cry or something like that. You can also see along the Via Dolorosa, allegedly the exact rock where Joseph of Arimathea cleansed Jesus, bathed him, put robes on him before taking him away to burial. Obviously, the chances of that being it are very little. But then once you go outside, you eventually find the Mount of Golgotha. And this is where the Temple Mount is on the right side. On the left side, where you have the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that's where the Mount of Golgotha traditionally has been placed. Church of the Holy Sepulchre now sits on top of it. There's obviously quite a bit of interest in this area, specifically from all three of these major Abrahamic religions. The fact that there's peace between those walls at all, I think, is a testament to good politics or maybe something, because all three of these different religions claim it as their own. You can still go visit all of this, obviously, anytime you want to. Maybe don't go this week. That's a bad week for it. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's anywhere you have water. And that's the argument, is that there's not really a lot of available freestanding water to baptize 3,000 people. Obviously, you can't, if you had them around the clock, you probably couldn't do 3,000 in ours. You can, though, if you have those stationed around Jerusalem. So that's the argument for it. All right, if there's nothing else, we'll pick up with Rome next week. Thank you, everybody.